So today's video is going to focus on the skeletal system, and we're going to kind of introduce bone cells, how bones are formed, and then we'll move forward from there. Okay, so first let's talk about what our skeletal system is made of. So our skeletal system is obviously made out of bones, okay? And we will be going through and we'll be talking and learning the vast majority of bones in your body, and you'll be able to just recognize them on sight. Your skeletal system, in addition to bones, it's going to be made of joints. Joints are really just the places where two bones come together. Your knee is a joint, your elbow is a joint. But also like right here where your ribs and your sternum come together, that's a joint. I can't see that color very well. Like that's a joint right there where your ribs and sternum come together. Where the bones in your skull come together, that's a joint. So just again, generically, anywhere where two bones come together. Cartilage is part of your skeletal system. A lot of hyaline cartilage at the end of the long bones, some elastic cartilage, some fibrocartilage. You can see according to your key here, right? All the blue, greens, and red areas are areas where you're going to find different types of cartilage. And we'll talk more about that when we get into bones, into joints with a little bit more detail. And last, the ligaments. Ligaments, I know a lot of you have probably heard of ligaments as well as tendons. Right? Ligaments are bone to bone. So ligaments help hold bones together, where a tendon is muscle to bone. Okay. Some functions of the skeletal system are obviously protection. Okay? It helps protect the soft organs. You can see in this picture over here, you can see how the brain is inside the skull here. So it gives that hard protection there. It allows for or facilitates movement. You can see that down here, basically because it has the joints and it gives the muscles something to pull on. The muscles can then use the bone like a lever, and then the muscle can actually cause movement. If the muscle was unable to adjust the position of the bone, then you would not see any movement. Okay? The skeletal system also helps store minerals and store fat. It does this in what we call yellow bone marrow. We'll talk about red bone marrow in a little bit. Okay? But yellow bone marrow is going to store minerals and fat. Minerals in particular would be calcium and phosphorus. And you can see them right here, storing and releasing that calcium and phosphorus. Okay? And you can see here the store and the release of fat. This here is the yellow bone marrow there. Your skeletal system also does hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the production of blood cells. And it's just a fancy term for it. So the bone marrow in particular helps produce blood cells. Okay, so you're going to want to file this crazy word away here, hematopoiesis. And then last but not least, the skeletal system gives support for all of the body structures. The bone offers that support for our systems. So your skeletal system as an adult consists of approximately 206 bones, and your skeletal system is divided into two portions. It's divided into the axial portion and the appendicular portion. When we do our lab practicals in class, we will split it as well into an axial lab practical and an appendicular lab practical. So the axial skeleton is going to consist of the skull, which is the bones in the cranium or the head and in the face, the vertebral column, so the bones of your spine, and then the bony thorax, like the ribs, the sternum. You can see in the diagram over here, the blue is the axial skeleton. So the skull, the bony thorax, and the spine here. The appendicular skeleton is basically your arms and legs, your upper and lower limbs, and then the bones that attach your arms and legs to the axial skeleton. You can see those are in yellow here. You've got the pectoral or the shoulder girdle here, which holds our upper limb on. And then we have the pelvic girdle here, which is attaching the lower limb. And like I said, our lab practicals will be divided into axial and appendicular lab practicals. So let's talk a little bit about the microscopic anatomy of the bone. You've seen the bone under your microscope. It should have looked, kind of similar to that, right? And so the bone under the microscope, you can see basically two different divisions of bone. You have the trabecular, or also called the spongy bone, And then you have the cortical or compact bone, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the trabecular or spongy bone has lots and lots of openings. So if we're looking at this diagram over here on the right, this is my trabecular or spongy bone. And in this like wedge here, this is the trabecular or spongy bone. Lots and lots of openings. And those openings are due to the trabeculae. The trabeculae are the little spikes. You can see those pretty well in this zoomed in one down here at the bottom, right? All these little spikes of bone, those are your trabeculae, and they're what give all the openings. The benefits to this is it makes this spongy bone pretty strong in lots of different directions. So it can handle forces coming from a variety of different directions, which is beneficial in help keeping the bone from breaking. All those little openings are also going to help lighten the skeleton, right? They're going to be full of air, so it makes it a little less heavy. Okay? And then the trabecular or the spongy bone contains the red bone marrow. You can see that in this diagram over here. Remember, the red bone marrow, you can see the blood vessels that are being produced here. The red bone marrow is where that hematopoiesis is taking place, so where those blood cells are being formed. So the cortical or compact bone, this has very few openings, right? As the compact part may suggest. It's really strong in one direction. Okay? If you look at these, you'll see how there's very few openings. The fibers are really packed in there. And so it is really strong in one direction. Really, in particular, this is very beneficial for compression type forces, right? Like every time you take a step in that force, you send up your leg bone, right? So the strength in one direction is really important for these compressive forces. So our cortical or compact bone is made up of osteons. Osteons are considered like the functional unit of bone. They're also called a Haversian system. So again, this is our functional unit of bone. And I spelled it wrong here. This should be SI. And you have a diagram that you may want to start labeling. You may want to pause and use this right now to help you find some of the labels on that diagram that you need to be working through. So again, each osteon is considered a functional unit. And if you look at this picture up top, like this diagram here, this rectangle, that's an osteon. Each one of these big circular units, each one of those is considered an osteon. And so the osteon is going to contain one central or Haversian canal. You can see it going right through the middle of these osteons in this upper picture here. You can see that Haversian or central canal in the middle of the osteons on the bottom picture. So that Haversian canal here is going to contain blood vessels. It's going to contain arteries. It's going to contain veins. It'll contain nerves. Okay? And that will allow nourishment and waste products to get removed from that bone tissue. The ones that are here going like side to side, and these canals here that are perpendicular to those central canals, those are the perforating, or they're also called Volkmann's canals. So these perforating canals, they're going to connect the osteons, the central canals of the various osteons. So again, it's allowing exchange of nutrients throughout the bone here. The lamellae are going to be the rings. So as you're looking at your diagrams and you're seeing this ring pattern here, the lamellae are those rings. So each one of these rings is considered a different lamellae. Okay? And then within the lamellae, you're going to see these small little openings. If you remember your microscopic picture, it would look, here, let's try the colors. You'd see almost what looked like a squished spider, and then it would look like that, and then it would have the ring shape coming around. Well, these little openings here, these are my lacunae. They're like little caves. You can see them in this, you can see them in all these pictures, right? These little openings here, those are our lacunae. Realizing that bone is solid, but bone is also a living tissue. So if bone is a living tissue, then it's going to need cells, right? It's going to need cells, and those cells need physical space to live in. So these lacunae are the openings where the bone cells live. They're like little caves that the bone cell can live in. And then the canaliculi are the small little canals that are going to connect the lamellae. They're going to connect the lamellae and the lacunae to one another. So by connecting, basically these canaliculi are going to connect the bone cells to each other. So those bone cells can exchange nutrients and can exchange information. Okay, so again, hopefully you've paused, take a few minutes, and I would go ahead and label your diagram now. Okay, so we have three basic types of bone cells that we're going to focus on here. So we have osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteocyte. So if you haven't caught on yet, right, osteo is bone. So an osteoblast is a bone cell that lays down new bone. Most people want to say it's a blast. So, like it gets rid of the bone, it blows it up, but it actually builds, B for build, right? So the osteoblast is going to build bone. It's going to help lay down bone. Okay? And you can see that right here, right? Here's my osteoblast laying down osteoid and creating new bone matrix. My osteoclast, then, these are the ones that are breaking down bone. So the osteoblast is going to lay down the bone. It's going to pull up calcium and store it, where the osteoclast is going to break down the bone. And so that would release calcium out. And so this one over here would be my osteoclast, helping break down the bone, remodel the bone based on the different forces and stuff that are acting on the bone at the time. The mature bone cells that are sitting in those lacunae, sitting in the lacunae right here, okay, those are the osteocytes. These are the ones that are just maintaining the bone, okay, and they help maintain the bone matrix. These are considered our mature bone cells. We're not going to worry about this last one right here, these stem cells. Okay, so let's look at what we call a long bone here. We'll look at different types of bone later, but today we're going to focus on a long bone. So a long bone is considered a long bone just because it's longer than it is wide. So that doesn't mean it actually has to be long, because long is a relative term, right? There's not a minimum standard length that it needs to be. It just needs to be longer than it is wide. So for example, if you have a bone that is that big, it is a long bone because it is longer than it is wide. So a long bone has kind of two major parts, a diaphysis and an epiphysis. So the diaphysis is made mostly of compact bone. This is the shaft of the bone. So if you look at the diagram over here on the side, and again, you should also have a diagram that you can label and work with. So here's your diaphysis here, the shaft of the bone. So this is made mostly of compact bone, and it contains the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is a hollow space that's going to run the length of the bone. This is a zoomed in view here of my diaphysis here, and you can see the yellow bone marrow there inside of the medullary cavity, which again is the hollow opening of running the length of the diaphysis. On the outside of the diaphysis, surrounding the diaphysis, you have what's called the periosteum. Remember, peri is around, right? Osteum is bone. So this is the connective tissue that is wrapped around the bone, okay? Surrounding the outside of the bone. It's a fibrous, real tough connective tissue. And it's connected to the bone by what are called Sharpie's fibers. You can see all these little individual fibers here that are holding that periosteum on. So again, your Sharpie's fibers are attaching your periosteum to the diaphysis of the long bone. At the ends of the long bone, you have the epiphysis. So the epiphysis is the heads. You've got a epiphysis at the proximal end and epiphysis at the distal end. So these are the heads of the long bones. The epiphysis contains mostly spongy bone. So you might see some red bone marrow up in that epiphysis. The epiphysis is connected to the diaphysis by either the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal line. You can see in this picture here, it's an epiphyseal line. An epiphyseal plate is what we're going to see in children. When that epiphyseal plate is present, the bone can get longer. The bone is able to grow and get longer. And as the child grows and develops, eventually that epiphyseal plate will fuse into an epiphyseal line. And that's what you see in adults. And this is why we reach a certain height and we don't keep going past that certain height, because our epiphyseal plate has fused into an epiphyseal line. And so when that happens, the bone stops getting any longer. And then the ends of these epiphyses is lined with articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. You can see this blue in each diagram here, but it keeps the bone tissue of the two bones that meet at the joint from rubbing directly together, which is very painful. So let's look at how the bone is formed. So the bone is formed through a process called bone modeling. And so bone modeling is when we form new bone, and that new bone is going to be laid down or formed by those osteoblasts. So in an embryonic skeleton, in a developing embryo, the skeleton is made of hyaline cartilage. And as the fetus develops, that hyaline cartilage is eventually replaced with bone. And that process of replacing that with bone is ossification. Right? So this is what occurs in the fetus as we replace that hyaline cartilage with actual bone tissue. And so it occurs in two phases. In the first phase, we lay down a bony matrix. We lay down a shell. Right? You can see that happening down here at the bottom. You're laying down that outside bony matrix shell, and it's going to cover. You're going to lay that down on top of the hyaline cartilage. And so it's going to cover the hyaline cartilage. And these osteoblasts are who's going to lay that down. And then the second phase would be the osteoclast then starting to remove the hyaline cartilage. And when it removes the hyaline cartilage from the middle here, you start forming then that medullary cavity. And you remove the hyaline cartilage out of the middle here, and you are left then with that outside shell of bone that was laid down in the first phase. So the osteoblasts lay down the bone matrix shell, and then the osteoclasts will move in and start breaking down the hyaline cartilage. For us to get taller, our longitudinal growth, that's going to occur at those epiphyseal plates. And so those epiphyseal plates, remember we said before, this is in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. And you can see right here where that epiphyseal plate, it's made of cartilage. And so what's happening there is you've got osteoblasts on one side of it, and they're laying down new bone. And so we have these osteoblasts here laying down this new bone, which pushes and makes us taller. However, you also have these osteoblasts that are laying down new bone are eventually going to hit the bone on the other side of that epiphyseal plate. And when they move fast enough and they hit the bone on the other side of the epiphyseal plate, that's when we get the fusion and it stops increasing in length. Now, our bones can get bigger throughout, even as an adult, as in bigger around, they're just not longer. So circumferential growth, growing in a circle here, is going to occur throughout lifetime. And what's happening here is we're laying down extra bone on the outside. The osteoclasts will break down some of the inner layers, while the osteoblasts are laying down new bone on the outsides. So as an adult, our bones can be remodeled. Remember, bone, again, is a living, dynamic tissue. So as an adult, we start to lose collagen as we age. If you remember from our tissues, right, bone is a connective tissue, and it's going to be made of matrix and fibers, right, ground substance. And so it's going to have matrix and fibers. Bone has a lot of collagen in it. And as we age, that collagen starts to break down. And as that collagen starts to break down, it decreases in elasticity or its ability to stretch. Okay? And our bones become more brittle because of this decrease in collagen as we age. The bone mineral will peak for women usually between 25 and 38, and for men between ages 30 and 35. Okay? Some things that can remodel your bones, okay, would be forces like gravity. You hear a lot about like astronauts who they have to figure out ways to do certain physiological things because there is no gravity if it's affecting their body. Okay? Muscles, you remember again, they're attached to the bone, they're pulling on the bone, so they're exerting force on the bone. Okay? A fall, a crash, and this should say forces. Okay? So gravity, muscles, impaction, all of those can influence our bone remodeling as an adult. Basically what happens is the bone takes these forces and it will use them to change its bone mineral density. So for example, okay, if I get hypertrophy of the bone, you can see this in this top x-ray. This bone's a little skinny, this bone is fatter. Okay, that hypertrophy of the bone here is due to a result of larger, stronger forces pulling on the bone. That's what exercise does. That's why when they say that the best exercise for bone health is resistance exercise, weight-bearing exercise, because it's putting more force into the bone, and the bone will respond by laying down more bone. Okay, so we get stronger, denser bones. Okay, some people have reduced forces and they can end up with atrophy. You can see these bones here are a lot skinnier. Okay, this could be somebody that's bedridden or in a wheelchair, so they're not putting a lot of forces into the bone. Swimmers, while they may have excellent other athletic attributes from their swimming, because there is no gravity, they can have an issue with actual bone atrophy. And this was talking about with astronauts, and again, their lack of gravity, because again, every time we take a step, we stand up, we're fighting gravity, which is helping put forces into our bones. So we're going to stop here. Hopefully you have 2 diagrams taken care of and labeled, and we're going to be doing some work with bone remodeling in class in ossification and starting to name some bones.